Welcome to Babblecom 5. This is episode 8 of season 4 of Babylon 5, The Illusion of Truth. I'm not worried. Tell that to your face. Sheridan and Ivanova exchange concerns over income, with Earth having quarantined the station. They sit in a decidedly quiet war room, Sheridan playing with a staff hero model that would never have been used in the shooting of the show. He's mainly concerned about his dad. Ivanova's sure he can look after himself. She also says she's glad Zach was put in charge of security, just as he makes a little bit of a fuss in the docking area with what turns out to be an ISN film crew. Franklin tells Sheridan he needs to pull some doctors off normal duties to look after their stock of cryogenically frozen telepaths as they move to alternative facilities. Sheridan tells him to do what he needs to, hoping one day they'll be able to help them, as he wonders what else the legacy of the Shadow War will be. In the meantime, he has to go deal with something worse than shadows, the reporter. It transpires that Ivanova threatened to throw him out the airlock by his collar. Sheridan is shocked by this and reminds Ivanova they are short on clothes, so strip them first, then throw them out the airlock. The reporter explains that he falsified his manifest believing his crew's equipment wouldn't have been allowed on. He was right, in part. The crew would have been welcome. His technology, not so much. He accepts that ISN is a propaganda tool for Clark, but makes out that he is trying to tell what truths he can whilst continuing to work for them. If they work with him, rather than against him, then they stand a better chance of getting some elements of their story across. Ivanova and Sheridan exchange looks. Garibaldi is plying his new trade, which currently involves hunting down drowsy statues filled with the actual family heirlooms, or possibly cash. Once that's out of the way, he's joined by a concerned Lanier. From his point of view, serving his people has no time limit and it brings honour, but Garibaldi explains he's got enough honour for the time being. Garibaldi asks after Delenn and cuts Lanier off when he mentions Sheridan, who then appears, of course, as the devil tends to when mentioned. With the reporter in tow, Sheridan asks Mr. Lanier to give him a tour Minbari style, in other words, truthful. He and Sheridan exchange looks, but not pleasantries. Garibaldi flashes back to his time in captivity when he was told to work only for them, then heads off. Lanier confirms that alien ships, including a White Star we've seen being opened up, are being repaired outside the station for material costs only, as they would not otherwise have made it home after the war. One of the floating cameras repeatedly headbutts him, perhaps trying to provoke him. He returns the favour once the reporters have left the lift ahead of him. He shows Mr. Randall down below, explaining that this is the home of the station's underclass who have become trapped on the station. Again accurate, but of course ripe for exploitation later. They run into Franklin, who gets a message about the cryosystems being started back up, and of course that the camera captures too. As it does Londo intercepting Sheridan to complain about the Arctic conditions in his quarters. Then it's on to a sit-down interview with Delenn and Sheridan. This explores both the reasons for Babylon 5 breaking away and the nature of Delenn and Sheridan's relationship. Again, the sound bites of their caring about each other will undoubtedly be misconstrued, with some clever editing. Then it's off to see Mr. Garibaldi. No need for editing here, one suspects, although we don't actually see what he says. Sheridan and Delenn join Ivanova to eat a couple of weeks later when the Stellarcast goes out. They knew going into it they were exposing themselves in a way, but they believe they limited their statements in such a way that they couldn't have been twisted. The ISN broadcast is led by the Clark puppet who first appeared when ISN came back online, having been taken over by his forces prior to Severed Dreams. Apparently Mars has not been fully taken by Clark's forces and a curfew is still in effect on Earth. Meanwhile, sedition trials are underway, and we see one such so-called criminal naming others under what is clearly duress, as two guards are shown in close proximity to him. Then there's a brief history info break. It's Cycle's 100th birthday this year. Then our man Dan has his shot. He notes the alien ships under repair outside the station, White Stars included. Then twists Lanier into the Minbari overlord of down below, with the downtrodden humans living in squalor and protesters sedated and taken where? Then it's suggested that high-ranking aliens are in charge of Sheridan using the Londo footage. They use an expert to suggest that veterans of the Earth-Minbari War have had their sense of reality warped, so they look up to aliens, similar to a Helsinki hostage syndrome symptom. He also draws attention to a call to Franklin about the cryosystems before taking a break, coming back with noting that Earth tax dollars are being used to repair a war fleet put together by Sheridan and Delenn. And Delenn and Sheridan's comments are then interspliced with footage of Dan speaking that didn't happen at the time, so they're out of context. Clever. Mr. Garibaldi's piece isn't actually that damning, but suggests Sheridan has changed after coming back from alien space, and now has a god complex, only listening to aliens and becoming harder to talk to. Then Dan has footage of the cryo unit, including Bester's lover, who's focused on briefly. He then concocts a conclusion about the presence of the fleet and the abduction of humans for storage in cryostasis. Franklin is filmed denying the cryo units are in use currently. They go back to the expert. He suggests that some with Minbari War syndrome start to wish they were themselves alien. So the line becomes that Sheridan is unstable and therefore more susceptible to alien influence, with that influence coming from Delenn, who has come up with a new way to attack humanity using genetics rather than the sword, with a fleet to back her up. He asks, is Delenn a Minbari-human hybrid the face of humanity's future? He mentions in an offhand way that the Sheridan family farm is burned down, but says Sheridan's father is missing rather than dead. He makes out that rather than wanting to punish Sheridan, they just want to help him with his condition and bring him back into the fold. Ivanova stares 1 second longer at the screen and leaves. Delenn moves to comfort Sheridan, then also leaves. He stays a moment longer, walks to the screen, and turns it off with his link. This again is one of those episodes where I didn't remember much of it, but like the command crew, you know it's going to be a stitch-up right from the get-go. You just don't know exactly how it's going to be done. I actually thought they were going to use the footage of Lanier headbutting the camera, but that doesn't actually get used. In light of present circumstances in Ukraine, this episode does highlight very clearly just how suspect you need to be of media coverage, because as Dan himself points out, no one making a story is entirely agenda-free. The irony is that we suspect the use of deep fakes, but they weren't around when Babylon 5 was being made, so the ISN crew are doing it the old-fashioned way, and using a combination of distortion and surprisingly genuine investigative journalism to promote their fabricated viewpoint. Very interesting that the cryotube scene focused on Bester's lover as an example. We've seen her tube very recently, but I wonder if Earth Dome analysts picked her or allowed her to stay in the footage as a warning to Bester, or if it was pure coincidence. Equally, Bester could have been the one who passed information to them, although that would risk exposing his involvement in her recovery. You can mull that one over. I've certainly not noticed it before. I wouldn't have done had we not seen him so recently. As Sheridan notes, they knew Earth was going to take this shot at them, but what they failed to appreciate perhaps was just how slick Clark's propaganda machine clearly is at this point. ISN itself is merrily distorting the Mars situation and normalising the fact that a curfew is still in place months after Clark instigated martial law. Little jab at Clinton as president here as well, as 1999 hadn't happened at this point, yet some of his policies get referenced. Cheeky. Interesting that we saw various panels on White Stars and Drazi Sunhawks open whilst maintenance was being carried out. Not really something we've seen before, as B5 isn't really equipped for the space equivalent of dry dock maintenance, which is probably why they're a safe distance from the station. It means, of course, that under the guise of ISN, Earth has actually got quite a decent look at some of the innards of a White Star, which probably isn't great from a security point of view. Just to really put Dan in everyone's bad books, of course, there's the mention of Sheridan's family home right at the end, which is possibly what's prompted Sheridan to stand away from the others, because he's not going to be able to hide his anger at that one. This is a guy he was contemplating tossing out an airlock earlier in the episode, and now he's probably wishing he had done just that. As propaganda goes, there's no doubting it's a well-played piece on a number of levels, but that was personal. From Clark to Sheridan, with hate. I was just glancing at the B5 wiki, and interestingly, this was directed by none other than Veer Stephen First. I was actually looking to solve another little niggle I had, which was who was the psych expert he was played by. He was actually in The High Chaparral, a really ancient Western series I watched as a kid, so it may be that was what my neurons were trying to tell me. I had him pegged as a Centauri mentally, something about his hair. So, I make it about 1-1 thus far in the long-range sparring match between Clark and Sheridan. So where do we go from here? One thing's for sure, Garibaldi is going to face some blowback, as he anticipated he would. Sheridan, on the other hand, is going to want payback on Clark. And let's face it, with the Shadow War over and Delenn noting that he hates to be bored just last episode, Sheridan's new pet project is likely to be doing something with all those White Stars getting fixed up outside the station. Be rude not to, after all. It's also worth noting that this episode is an interesting mirror to A Now for a Word, whose name has just popped into my head, which was filmed by ISN as a sort of an ISN documentary during the Narn Centauri conflict, and I think that was the last time that they reported directly from the station. And you can see how things have changed with ISN, because obviously that time, although the lady reporter was getting fed propaganda by both Jakar and Londo, this time it's rather different, because now ISN is creating the propaganda itself rather than being fed it. So it's interesting to compare the two and see just what difference the reporting attitude can make to how the story comes across. Just thought I'd mention that as for comparator purposes. So it's not a sort of a vital episode as the episodes go, but it is making things a little bit more personal for the Earth Force officers on the station, and it's also obviously impacting on the way in which aliens are viewed back home as well. So it's clearly open season on the station at this point, and clearly they're going to need to respond in some way, because at some point Earth's going to take the initiative from them if they don't do something first. So it'll be interesting to see where this goes from here, and I will see you for the next one. Cheers for now.